Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I'm Vered Kogan, and I am absolutely thrilled to introduce you to Dr. Dean Raiden. Dr. Raiden is Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, known as IONS. He is an Associated Distinguished Professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies and Chairman of the biotech company Cognigenics. He earned a Master of Science degree in Electrical Engineering and a PhD in Psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And in 2022 was awarded an honorary Doctor of Science degree from the Swami Vivekananda University in Bangalore, India, an institution of higher learning accredited by the Indian government and specializing in yoga practice and research. Before joining the IONS research staff in 2001, Dr. Raiden worked at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He has given over 670 talks and interviews worldwide and is author or co-author of some 300 scientific and popular articles, 4 dozen book chapters, and 9 books, 4 of which have been translated into 15 foreign languages: The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, and his latest, Real Magic. Dr. Raiden, it is absolutely an honor and a pleasure to have you here with us today. Thank you.
Pleased to be here. Thank you.
So maybe start by you explaining what is noetic science?
Well, the word noetic is actually very similar to what we mean by intuition. It's about a deep form of knowing. And so if someone simply knows something and they feel that it's certainly true, and later it turns out that it is true, but they have no way of knowing where did that come from? Where did the information come from? That would be considered a noetic experience. So ultimately, we're talking about different kinds of experiences that people have where they know things without knowing how they know it.
And one of the things that I hear often from senior leaders is that when they have made decisions based on that intuitive guidance, that it has really worked for them. And sometimes when they didn't listen to that little voice, because let's say it went against market data or what some of their staff might have said to them, that it hasn't worked out for them. What do you see in the research around intuition?
Well, so I see intuition in several different categories. One is forgotten expertise. So anybody who works in a given field for a long time will eventually learn things, and they'll know much more than that can be brought to conscious awareness at any given time. So that's forgotten expertise, and that's very valuable. That's the difference between somebody who's experienced versus not experienced, that you'll make decisions that are different because of that knowing. The second category is that there's peripheral vision, peripheral sensing. There's an enormous amount going on that we're sensing, but we're not consciously aware of. So if you take those first 2 categories in, forgotten knowledge and peripheral sensing, the story that explains it is a firefighter who's running towards a burning building. Well, their experience tells them that the building is not burnt so much that they can't run inside and save somebody. So they'll go do that because it's a combination of what their senses are telling them combined with their knowledge. And even though they don't consciously make the decision about whether they should run in or not, that's an intuitive response based on what they knew. And so oftentimes they're correct. They will get in the building, they'll save people. Or not, depending on whether their intuition says, no, this is about to collapse, I'm not going to go in. And oftentimes it will collapse. So the third kind of intuition, which is what I study and what I'm mainly interested in, and that is what sometimes people will call a download. They'll do a meditation, they'll do just out in nature or something, and they'll get the enormous amount of information suddenly that seems to come out of the blue. And sometimes the information involves future inventions or a decision that they had to make or something. It just seems to arrive. The thing about those kinds of intuitive hits is that they, along with that information comes a sense of certainty that it's correct. So it's not vague. It's like a fully downloaded something, like you know that this is correct. And when you look at the lives of famous composers and artists and inventors, almost all of them will have one or more stories where they're talking about this thing that just arrives, and then they may spend the rest of their life figuring out what to do with it. So I'm interested in, well, where does that information come from? It wasn't previous knowledge. It had nothing to do with sensory information. What else could it be? And so that's the type of intuition that I study. And in many ways, it's the most interesting form as well, because at this point, we don't have very good theoretical explanations as to where it comes from, but those intuitions change the world. They change politics, they change business, they change personal lives across the board. So it behooves us to get a better understanding of where it comes from and maybe how to enhance the likelihood that it will appear rather than simply being spontaneous.
Thank you, Dr. Raiden. So what do we know about where it might come from?
Well, first I'll describe a little bit about Cognigenics, this company that I co-founded, because it came from a download. It wasn't mine. It was my co-founder who was on an LSD trip and had this, then this was 50 years ago. On an LSD trip, he had this download of the whole method of how to enhance human cognition and perception. And he had to wait 48 years for the technology to catch up to the point where we can actually do that now. So the point of our company is to develop a non-invasive precision neuroengineering method to treat a whole range of psychiatric disorders, and to also create a method for cognitive enhancement. Because if you can treat dementia, for example, it means that you have found a way to enhance memory. Well, if you enhance memory in somebody who's having a problem with memory, you would go from dementia to not dementia, which is important. But if you go with somebody who has a normal memory into a super memory, well, that's the kind of enhancement that we're ultimately interested in doing, but we're starting simple. So we're starting with treatments for anxiety and depression that do what SSRI drugs do, but do it in an entirely new way by addressing the underlying source of anxiety and depression, rather than doing what is normally done with monomolecular drugs, where you take it and it goes everywhere in your body and there are all kinds of side effects. We have a way of bypassing all of that now, non-invasively. So that's an example of a download that was 50 years ahead of its time, and finally the rest of the world caught up with now providing a way of doing that. Well, where does that information come from? Well, in the vernacular, those kinds of experiences are typically called something like a synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence, and more specifically, all of the various psychic phenomena, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and so on. So this, as a scientific topic, is controversial. And at this point, it's strange that it's not controversial because we don't have experimental data. We have a century of experimental data showing that those kinds of skills are actually real things. The reason it's controversial is because science does not yet have a good explanation for why we would be able to have these experiences. That is beginning to change, and it's relevant to the idea of where do the downloads come from. Because certainly from the development of quantum mechanics, which is almost 100 years old now, we know that the physical world is not the way that we experience on an everyday level. At an everyday level, our understanding of physics is essentially what we call classical physics, but a refinement of classical physics using mathematics. And it works really well. We were able to go to the moon and just purely with Newtonian mechanics. But the modern world now runs on quantum mechanics, which is a more accurate description of what's happening, not only at the microscopic level, but at the macroscopic as well. And more importantly, the development of quantum biology, which is relatively new, but is showing that living systems not only operate in quantum ways, but that it's necessary for living systems to be able to use quantum mechanical effects in order to just behave the way that we behave. So at the leading edge there then is evidence, new evidence within the past year that the brain, it's certainly at a quantum level, it is quantum like every other physical system, but it behaves in a quantum fashion, the brain. So that what that means is there are two elements of quantum mechanics which make it seem strange, sort of called the weird elements of quantum mechanics, because they're not like everyday reality. One is non-locality, so the meaning that things are connected through space and time, and the other are observational effects, where the act of observing something changes its behavior. Those two elements they're considered weird from outside of the quantum world, but if you're involved in that, it's not weird at all. It's predicted by the mathematics of that theory. Well, if the brain operates even to a very small degree in a quantum fashion, it would mean that some of our experiences should have non-local components to them, meaning that maybe the brain is giving rise to awareness and all that, but your awareness is not limited to inside your head or your senses. It spreads out through space and time. So that gives a little bit of an understanding that, well, where did that information come from? We have the capacity to be aware of anything in the universe and anything even in time, forward or backwards in time. Because the quantum effects in the brain are not probably, most of the brain is acting in a classical fashion, classical physics, that's what the neurosciences are studying, but some of it does not. Like to a small extent, it does not. So we have, to a small extent, the ability to gain information from anywhere. And if you're highly motivated and focused, you can pull in that information at will. So in a laboratory, when we're studying things like clairvoyance, which is the ability to perceive through space and time, we are asking people to do a very specific task, get information about that thing, which is in another room or tomorrow, and then they have to get the information. So it's much more difficult than in the spontaneous real world where you have high motivation and focus. This is now a laboratory controlled experiment, and we know through 100 years of experiments that people can do that on demand. So in the real world, outside the laboratory, the idea that somebody can get this information just flowing in is not surprising at all. So everything I've just described is on the edge of providing a plausibility narrative for why people are able to report these experiences and why they work. Well, this narrative says they work because we are partially operating as quantum objects or quantum systems, and we're able to do things that we know are possible within the quantum world. The other aspect of it that I mentioned was observer effects. So if part of the way that we're built is quantum-like, then if we observe things from a quantum perspective, we will change the external world. And there's evidence for that too. So on both sides, if we reimagine that the way a human being is put together is partially described in classical physics terms and partially in quantum physics terms, a whole range of new possibilities open up as to what should be possible. And as I said, from an empirical perspective, we know that it's possible. So we're slowly connecting what we know empirically with what we can imagine theoretically.
It is fascinating, and I'm familiar with some of the research because I've read in the books and seen the many videos that are available. And so for those individuals now that want to learn, how do I do this? How do I tap into that source of intuition that we would consider quantum, right? Beyond space and time. What are some steps?
The classic step is meditation. That's the easiest and gentlest approach. We have done surveys among beginning and advanced meditators, asking them about what kinds of experiences that they had, especially shortly after they began to do meditation. So the number one thing that comes up again and again is becoming aware of synchronicities. So there are coincidences that happen, but they're meaningful coincidences, and they're like noticing them happen a lot. A little bit more advanced, you'll have people saying they see things, they perceive things that are distant in space and time. In other words, clairvoyance or precognition. And then quite a bit further down the line, and for only a small percentage of meditators who have some kind of a natural talent, they're talking about mentally being able to manipulate aspects of the physical world. So psychokinetic effects. So I bring up the notion of talent because even in something like meditation, while anybody can learn how to do that, some people have a talent for it. And so they get into very deep states very quickly. And so can you train talent? Probably not, right? So the metaphor I like to use here, or the analogy is, everyone likes the idea that they can become a super psychic. Not everybody's going to learn how to play tennis to be able to go to Wimbledon or go to the Olympics, right? It takes an enormous amount of practice plus a natural affinity and ability to be able to do that. So what we found also is that when we interview people in business who are highly successful, oftentimes they will admit that they use their intuition, they rely on it. And occasionally in private, after a couple of beers, they will start telling their psychic stories. And it takes, these stories generally are not told loudly in public because people are afraid of saying such things. But in private, you hear it all the time.
Yeah. And I hear them oftentimes when I do presentations to groups of leaders and about mindset and the power of belief and intention, and people feel kind of a safe environment. And so they share some of those things. And yet you're right. Like a lot of people are fearful of sharing that. And yet we have research. You mentioned your research. I know HeartMath does a lot of research on non-local intuition. And so meditation is one way. And I imagine, that some people initially struggle with that. Of course, it's a practice like everything else. What are some additional or other things that they can do to connect with that, with those parts of themselves?
So one piece of information on that are the Yoga Sutras. So written about 2,000 years ago, based on an oral tradition that goes back even much farther. We don't know when the oral tradition began. But the Yoga Sutras is the classical book of yoga. And one of the 4 books involved in that is all about these various powers. They call them the siddhis in Sanskrit. And they're the same kinds of phenomena we're talking about. So the very first siddhi that is mentioned is perception through space and time. So today we'd call it clairvoyance or remote viewing. So they mentioned then, or Patanjali, who wrote it, said, well, there's several ways that you can gain these powers. One is meditation and yoga. I mean, that yoga originally was basically just meditation. So meditation will do it. Psychedelics will do it. He didn't use that term, of course, but that's what he meant. Certain drugs will do it. And genetic inheritance, meaning talent. So, right, these are methods. Well, you can't do the last one because it's your genetic inheritance in some way. Those are the methods, right, from very ancient times. And they're probably still all true today. We know that people taking psychedelics oftentimes will report that there's something like shared mind experiences and perceiving at a distance and precognitions, the whole range. So Patanjali was right 2,000 years ago. Yeah, and we're still the same humans as we are back now as we were then. So we have the same ways of learning and capacities and so on.
And so I'm curious, I've heard that memories are not actually stored in the brain, they're stored in the field, and that in this non-local entangled matrix, or whatever we decide to call that everything is woven, right? I've even heard you use the metaphor of a fabric, yes, fabric of reality. Mm-hmm. And so would you be willing to share, where do you believe these memories are that we tap into when we access guidance, those downloads? And what does this have to do with entanglement?
Those are both very difficult questions, and I have no answers to them, right? So there's current leading theories within the neurosciences as to how the network of neurons in the brain are able to encode. And we do know with artificial neural networks that you can encode all kinds of information in complex neural networks. And it's not located anywhere in particular in your brain. It's the entire network somehow captures bits of information which we then experience as a memory. And maybe that's part of it. But it also appears at times that we can get information from somewhere else. So it's not clear to me that that's a memory, right? If you got subliminal perception, I mean, imagine that clairvoyance is a little bit like subliminal perception, and there are some correlates there. If you were able to subliminally get information about something, you then have to interpret it, both before you speak it and then while you're speaking it, you have to interpret it in some way. So you'll get a snatch of something, and then you'll make up a story that will explain it to yourself. The research on subliminal perception shows this very clearly, that we'll get a little piece of information unconsciously typically, and then we'll make up a story about it just to explain it. I think something like that is going on when we get these psychic downloads, that we're getting information. And I've heard a lot of people tell me their downloads, and they're totally convinced that this will solve all the problems of the universe. But the way they express it is such that nobody else can use it because it doesn't mean anything to anybody else. I mean, they have it internally, but in the process of explaining what it is, they don't know what it is. So they have to put a story onto it, a narrative. And the narratives usually, especially if it's a technical download, it's too far away from being able to actually use the information. So what I was mentioning before about this download during an LSD experience that has led into a pragmatic use, it took a long time to get to the point where we had even the physical concepts to be able to use that information. So it may well be that somebody has a download, they feel it's very important. Maybe it's 200 years ahead of its time. Like, we don't even have the language to understand it yet. And I could believe that is actually the case, that somebody will say, I have this way that will turn anybody into a super psychic, and it involves crystals, and it involves frequency, it involves vibration and resonance, all of which are perfectly fine terms, but how are we sticking it together so that we can make a psychic technology? They have no idea. And I suspect that science has not caught up to that yet. We don't know. But as you mentioned, entanglement is probably an important component. So in one of my books, I'm talking about the possibility that telepathy or shared minds is related in some way to quantum entanglement. Because entanglement basically says that we live in a completely holistic environment, that everything is fully interconnected. We don't normally notice it, but it's there all the time. And so maybe some of our experiences that are involving things that are distant from us, if you imagine that you really are fully connected with everything, then in principle, you can know everything, but you can't cram it into your head because you can't get the universe inside your head very easily. So you have to pick and choose pieces of it and then figure out, if you're clever enough, how do I translate what I know into language that we currently understand that would make sense to somebody else? Well, before quantum mechanics, none of this made any sense because we didn't think that the physical world could support these kinds of things. Quantum mechanics, as we know it today, is not the end of the story. It's probably the beginning of the story of something which is way more complicated and way more interesting that maybe we'll discover in 20 to 50 years, or maybe next Tuesday. So we don't know when that's going to happen. That's the whole idea of a breakthrough. But I strongly suspect that all of the anomalous experiences that people talk about, from noetic experiences, psychic experiences, including mystical experiences, the first person experience of being entangled with the universe, essentially, then we'll find that the physical world not only supports that, but a better understanding of the physical world will tell us in some detail how and why these things work. And as we know from development of technology, the moment you get a really good idea about how something works, you're able to do all kinds of things with it. You can enhance it, you can suppress it, you can do all kinds of interesting things. So I think one of the reasons why this topic tends to be controversial and interesting at the same time is because if we were able to develop a technology which strongly enhances these kinds of capabilities, it would significantly change the way the civilization works. And there's a lot of status quo that does not want you to change those sorts of things. And to just give one example, the entire legal and business systems are based on the idea that we can maintain secrecy about certain topics. And psychic phenomena say that there are no secrets. You can't maintain secrecy because you're connected to everything. Just try to imagine how the legal system would be different if everything was suddenly transparent for real. And also in business, you can't have patents anymore because everybody knows everything. It would change a lot of the structure of the way that the world has evolved into. And the moment you challenge the status quo is going to push back really hard and say, no, I don't want, and no, they would say, I want that information, but I don't want the other person to have the information. And you can't have both at the same time. So
this is so fascinating, Dr. Raiden. And what relevance does intention and belief then have in being able to access our intuition?
Well, belief is a way of modulating what you can pay attention to. So if you strongly disbelieve something, you won't see it at all. And we know this even in testing things like psychic ability, that if you take a classroom of students and you separate them into the people who believe that these phenomena are possible and people who don't believe that, otherwise known as the sheep and the goats. The goats are the skeptics. And you have them all do exactly the same task. What you get more often than not, after 70 years of many repeated experiments using this general paradigm, the sheep-goat paradigm, you find that people who tend to be open to and believe in the possibility of any of these kinds of phenomena, including intuition falling out of the sky, they experience it in more often and in experimental context in a positive way, like there's positive evidence, as compared to the goats who are not open to it, and they generally either don't experience anything psychic at all, or they flip in the other direction, and they will get significant results, but backwards, almost as though unconsciously we all get this information, but belief becomes an openness filter, right? You can see it, or if you don't want to, you close it down and you don't see it. And this is where the belief filter happens, how much you can allow inside. So there's definitely a role for belief. There's a number of other personality traits, things like the psychological trait of openness, which is associated with belief. That also is a predictor of whether or not people have these experiences. There's some bits of evidence that extroversion and introversion make a difference, but it's not entirely clear how, and that some people who are more extroverted will tend to have more experiences of this type, but introverts can too, depending on the context. So it depends a lot on where you are and what context you're in as to whether that particular personality trait will make a difference. And so I was trying to express here is that personality, belief, predilections, genetics, all of them matter, and they matter slightly differently depending on the context. So it's a highly complicated system, which is why there's no easy answer to any of this. But on the other hand, it also becomes much more interesting as a scientific puzzle, because as often happens, the more you know about something, the more complex it is. Not the simpler, but the more complex, especially when it comes to human behavior.
Yeah, thank you. And so if we were to look through the lens of meditation for a moment, which is one of the ways, as you said, that we can access more of this, is there a particular type of meditation, intention that we should have going into the meditation? What can we do to accelerate that ability?
Well, this is similar to the question we get sometimes after studying the effect of intercessory prayer on health. People immediately want to know, well, which faith is better at doing this? And our answer is, when we do these experiments, we have people from many different faiths using whatever method they use for prayer, which we just turn into a more secular form of intention. And we combine all the results because we don't want to get into religious wars. So it is similar then with meditation. Is one meditation better than another? I would say at this point, we don't really know, because people resonate differently with different meditative styles. And so I've tried many different methods, and I find that for me, Vipassana is the easiest. So that's what I do. Is it better than? No, it's not any better than any other method. I think ultimately they all end up in the same place. But as something that just fits your personality better, of course, you're going to find different meditation styles that are, some of which will work better for you and others that don't. And I think that when you start getting into any of them in a deeper sense, you will start to experience these kinds of phenomena. So I think it's the fact that meditation over the past maybe 40 years or 50 years went from being some weird exotic thing that only people in the Far East did to now being, you can get insurance paid for a course in mindfulness, for example, because it works so well. So I think more people are probably encountering these experiences, whether they call it psychic or not. They're encountering experiences that are historically and even some experimentally shown to open our awareness to these kinds of phenomena.
And I'm curious, in your research, do you see that setting a clear intention, maybe even visualizing that intention, kind of focusing on it, maybe also stepping back from that, does that accelerate or seem to have an effect on the intuition that we have access to?
It probably does, yes. The term that's used sometimes is effortless driving, right? So you use your intention, you focus your attention with an intention, and as intently as you possibly can, and then completely drop it. So that's easier said than done. It's difficult for most people to form a very tight intention and hold it for a while, because our mind wants to wander. But we do that nevertheless. You figure out some ritualized way or some other method where you can do that. You hold the intention really strong and have a very clear outcome for what you're looking for. Because if it's not clear, you'll get something, but it's like, it's like not having a goal. It's sort of flailing about. Something will happen, but unless it's extremely clear, it may not happen the way that you want or the way that you think you want it. And then combined with all of that, you periodically do very strong intention, and then you completely drop it, because as best as we can tell, these kinds of abilities are operating in the unconscious. It's like you're unconscious and the rest of the entire universe are somehow connected in some way. And evolution has shaped us into our awareness, our current present time awareness, to have extremely strong blinders about all that, for very obvious reasons. You want to survive. It doesn't help you to survive if you're paying attention to what happened on Pluto a billion years ago, even though you have the capacity to know that. It doesn't help. So if you want to survive, you have to pay attention to here and now. And we're quite good at that, even though we have mind wandering, we're snapped back as soon as the tiger appears. So part of this whole process then is getting back into a state where you don't need to worry about the tiger in front of you. And so that's what meditation does. And that's what certain psychedelics do. That's what all of these capacities of the mind allow us to do, to be open to the universe at large without having to pay close attention to what is happening right here and right now, because that is the way that evolution has shaped us.
Yeah, and thank you for explaining that so clearly. And what's really cool is that this whole podcast, this set of learnings, is about how to set intentions, but also to release any inner resistance to that, any doubt, or, and of course, when we're in a meditative state, we're, less in that conscious, right, survival type of place. There is kind of a more, as you said, kind of calm, ease state, and we're more open. And so what do you think, as we complete here, Dr. Raiden, is most important for influencers, change makers in our world, senior leaders or otherwise, that can create a new trajectory for all of us? What do they need to know?
Well, first, rely on your intuition and test it. Like test it continually, because it's very easy to get confused between an intuitive hit and fantasy. And so unless you're constantly having a cycle of testing your intuition, you don't want to get dragged into fantasy. And I've seen that happen in people who are actually quite good, quite intuitive, but then suddenly everything becomes an omen. And that's not very useful either. So that's one part, is to trust your intuition and test it. And the other thing is to encourage other people to use their intuition as well and test that too. So if you have like a strategic thinking section of a company, you ask everybody to use your intuition to project, what is next, what should we do, all of that, and then do what you do in any kind of context where you're taking all of the information and squishing it together and find what fits and what doesn't fit. So the danger there is groupthink, that everyone will start thinking the same thing, and it turns out that they're all completely compatible with what they're saying, but they're all wrong too. So at every step along the way, you need to keep doing sanity checks. Does this really right? Are we grounded on what we're thinking? The reason I say that is because it was thought for a long time that for people who are really good at clairvoyance or remote viewing in its current parlance, that if you wanted to figure out something about solve a crime or project a future event or something like that, get 20 or 30 remote viewers and have them all do it, and then let's put the information together, and maybe that'll be a good answer. It's like averaging all of these different pieces of intuition. Sometimes you'll get extremely high concordance among what everyone is saying. And you think, oh my God, we've nailed it, because everybody's agreeing on this thing, and it turns out everyone was wrong. And so there's some strange thing where we use the phrase sometimes of psychic space, that your psychic eye goes into a place and it could see something and it becomes attractive to other people doing a similar thing. And so you all end up in the same space. You all get convinced that it's all completely true, and it turns out that it's not true at all. It's a shared fantasy of some type. So the checking of the checking and calibration is another issue. Like if you're using your intuition and you've checked it and it never works out, well, then don't rely on it so much, because there's a certain talent that is necessary in order to separate the fantasy from the reality. Whereas other people are really good at that. Like almost every time they have a strong intuition about something, it turns out that they're right. Well, trust them more. So all of this has to do with this cycle of get the information and then test it, and do it over a long period of time to gain confidence that it's actually correct.
Yeah, thank you. And that is very important. And we often forget that. As you said, something happens and it worked out for us, and then all of a sudden we see omens everywhere and everything has meaning. And we tell ourselves all kinds of stories. And what's really cool is you brought up the concept of the team, to kind of have our team. And we had Lynn McTaggart, that I imagine you're familiar with, on this podcast talking about group intention. Mm-hmm. And so one last question, if it's okay, since you brought that up, the team thing. If everybody in the team has a common, clear intention for what it is that we want to create or solve, yes, does that impact our results?
I would say probably yes. On the other hand, we've done a number of experiments involving the role of intention in the physical world. So these are psychokinetic tasks, mind-matter interaction. And so if you have one person and one physical target, you can show that the one person's intention will cause a change in that physical target, usually very, very tiny change, but something that's measurable. So then people say, well, okay, well, what if we had 2 people intending? What if we had 1,000 people intending for something to have? Wouldn't that be like 1,000 times better? And the answer is no. And the usual reason is that, as we know, that if you get more than 2 people trying to do something, things can fall apart very quickly. Like one person could have a little bit of doubt, and the other person has a different doubt, and it destroys this bubble. You're creating like a soap bubble of intuition, and it's real. It's also very fragile. So if you're able to get a large group that was completely coherent, meaning like they're all completely in alignment, they all have the same intention, they know what they're doing, they're very clear about it, yes, then you probably will get a larger effect or more robust effect. It's not easy to produce that in large groups. That's why one of the reasons why Lynn McTaggart is saying, well, something around 8 is like a magical number where it's not too big, it's not too small, it's possible in a group that is really coherent in themselves. And every dimension you can think of, that can have more, quote, power than one person, unless the person is very, very talented, which happens sometimes, that they're just really good at what they can do. Or if you had a group of 8 people, none of whom were talented, that might not do anything either. So as in all cases here, there's no magic bullet. It's a combination of, as you were saying, coherence is important, talent is important, history of success is important. All of them are important elements in what turns out to be a very complicated system.
Yeah. Well,
but most importantly is that the phenomena are real, right? There's a lot of noise. Certainly when we do experiments in a laboratory, we see noise in these kinds of effects. But overall, when you look at the preponderance of evidence for things like perception through space and time, there's basically no doubt from an experimental point of view that that is a real phenomenon. It's not always as reliable as we'd like it to be. Some people are a lot better at it than others, but it is a real effect. And so in thinking then about the full range of intuitive kinds of experiences, some of them will have bits of elements that are coming from somewhere else. And of course, the challenge then is to figure out how to discriminate between your fantasy, your wishes, your intentions, and that real information. So plenty of people are teaching ways of improving, or not really so improving, but enhancing your ability to attend to intuition. And what I usually tell people is just quiet your mind. How do I do that? Well, meditation is one way of doing it. Some people can do it best through dream incubation, right? You set your mind as to what you're going to get in a dream. And in that state, you're generally not so worried about the tiger about to jump on you, and you can get all kinds of interesting information.
And I'm so grateful for all of the research that you have done, your team at IONS has done, because it is helping us. And for those individuals that are what we would consider skeptical, and of course, it's always good to be skeptical in the sense of being curious to explore, and grateful for all the research that you've done, because there is a lot to explore, and there is a lot of valid, evidence-based research showing that everything you shared today with us is absolutely true, and that information is available for those people that want to access it. So where can they learn more about the research of this and, of course, your work?
Well, so our institute's website is noetic.org, noetic.org, and it contains many of our publications and information about the rest of the things that the Institute do, including our history and our mission and so on. My personal website is deanraiden.com, where I have listed not all, but most of my publications going way back, 40 years already, and more information about books and talks that I give and things like that. Otherwise, and one of the things I added to my website was a library of articles, websites, and books that should be on the shelf of somebody who really wanted to understand what was going on here. And because it's controversial, if you go to a place like Wikipedia, you're going to get a certain way of seeing what some people think that they know. And what's interesting then is that you see this again and again, that people who begin to fall into the scientistic trap, where science becomes a kind of religion to them. And so if science does not have an explanation for something, they will say that this is pseudoscience. And this is one half of the way that science works. Science works both on empiricism and theory, both of them. One by itself is actually not very persuasive. This is one of the reasons why this realm of psychic phenomena is considered controversial, because we have an enormous amount of observations, but we don't have very much theory yet, with the possible exception of maybe quantum brain And suddenly that opens a theoretical way of thinking about things. So Wikipedia tends to be extremely conservative. In fact, it's really supportive only of the status quo. That's how you should think about Wikipedia. It's quite good in some respects, but it also is only supporting the status quo. And the status quo sometimes is right, and sometimes it's not right. So to gain a richer sense of what the nature of the evidence is and the implications and so on, you need to read a whole bunch of stuff going back to a century. So I put some of those articles and pointers to books and so on my website as well in the library section.
Thank you, Dr. Raiden. And my hallucination is that the more that we access this research and more of us allow ourselves to enter into a state of belief that this is actually true, because that's what the research proves to be, or at the very least suspending disbelief.
Yep.
Yeah, suspending that skepticism, that there will be more belief collectively, and then there will be more access to the research and to theories that will then bring even more data and proof and evidence. So I think that we're seeing that cycle going up, and it is in very large part thanks to you and your team. So thank you.
You're welcome. Just a comment about belief. People will often ask me, do you believe in psychic phenomena? And my answer is no, I don't believe in it. I believe in the data from our experiments. And if you interpret that data, especially since it's under controlled conditions, so we're able to exclude mundane explanations, that data implies that we have certain abilities. Whether we call it psychic or not, I don't really care. But the data and the experimental evidence is quite clear. So I believe in data. And both myself and most of my colleagues would fit into the category of a proper skeptic, as you were saying, someone who doesn't simply accept something on faith because somebody told us, and not even on our own experience, but something that could be shown under all of the conditions that science has developed to get rid of biases, human bias, analytical bias, all kinds of biases. So we use those methods and we still get interesting results. That's why I'm interested in this as a topic, because it says, from a conventional point of view about who and what we are, something really important is missing.
Right.
And so I want to know, what is it? What are we missing that's important? Well, people in the esoteric world that for millennia have been telling us that. There's huge literature on all this, but it doesn't sound scientific yet. Eventually it will.
Well, I honor your lifelong curiosity and the many gifts that you have given to all of us as a result of that curiosity and that passion and compassion and empathy for your fellow humans.
Thank you.